Well, hello there everyone, uxwbill here with you today. Even though it looks a little bit overcast out, make no mistake, this is the most beautiful day we have had in a long time, folks. It is almost, if not 70 degrees out here. Rather humid, it's been rainy, but that's a lot better than it was about 2 weeks ago when we were having blizzards and everything. Yes, folks, spring is finally on the way, and with it, the triumphant return of my outdoor situated video making activities. Now, I of course certainly did not come here to talk about the weather with all of you because it would be of very limited relevance for most of you, and even if it wasn't, you could go outside and experience it for yourself. But why go outside when you have a computer to play with? That's that's my theory. And I do have something of a special computer to play with today that I'm going to share with all of you because I know that all of you love that so much. What we have here is a Dell PowerEdge 2400. This is a Pentium 3 era system. And I have had a lot of folks come along over the years and say, hey, uxwbill, would you mind doing some videos about some server class computer hardware? Well, I don't have a lot of utility for server class hardware, and so that's why I've never made a video really discussing the exciting subject of server class hardware. You know, servers are oftentimes very noisy, they're big, they take up a lot of space, although space is not exactly at a premium for me. They tend to consume a lot more power than the average desktop. They don't tend to lend themselves to uses that are not server-oriented, especially due to their lackadaisical video performance. And finally, the most irksome thing about servers, at least in my view, is that you don't get all the features of the hardware if you pick one up somewhere. Sometimes you have to license certain things like integrated lights-out management, or in the case of this machine, as we'll see later, the ability to construct a RAID array on the built-in disk controller hardware. So what do we have here, and how did I come across this? My apologies for the wind noise. I hope it's not messing up the video soundtrack too badly. But I'm armed with a handy cam, so I have excellent countermeasures because, as V Westlife once put it, Sony's wind noise reduction is the best in the business, and I have certainly been thoroughly amazed by it before. But I digress. A couple of months ago, I bought a computer part on eBay. Turned out the seller was much closer to me than I expected, and offered me the option to do a local pickup and get $5 off the price of the item. I probably burned more than $5 worth of gas to go and get the item in question, but what the heck? Life's short. You might as well have a little bit of fun along the way. While I was there, I saw a number of used computers being collected for recycling and offered for sale. I picked up a system to be recycled, a Dell Dimension E310 series system that will be the subject of a future video, along with some software that I'm sure you have wondered whether or not uxwbill is actually using. Also sitting on the floor and officially offered for sale were a couple of these Dell servers. Now, most of them were newer than this, but I kind of like the design of this one. I like this waffle-styled front end, and it didn't look like it was too terribly in too terribly bad of a condition, but he wanted $40 for it. And folks, I am here to tell you, there is no way in the world, unless you are a business owner or you happen to need one of these in your IT department because the one you should have replaced 10 years ago finally keeled over, this is not worth $40. So a couple months go by, and I'm driving around in the countryside once again, and I decide, what the heck, I'm going to stop off at that computer shop and see if the guy will entertain an offer. Well, he wouldn't go for $10. But 20 he did. Now 20 is awfully hard to justify, especially when you need that $20 for other things like I did. But again, life is short, you might as well have a little bit of fun along the way. So I loaded this thing up, and I promptly began to wonder, do I need to have my head examined? I don't even know why I asked that. The obvious answer is yes. So let's see what I got for my $20, which I'm sure I will more than make back during the course of this video, thanks to Google's wonderful AdSense program. First and foremost, perhaps most importantly, I got the keys that go with the system. This one's a little bit broken, but the other one's in good shape. I don't know if these actually have a unique combination cut into them. I suppose that they probably do, even though a server is something that would rarely be seen outside of some sort of at least a semi-secured environment, hopefully. We do have a 3.5-inch floppy drive, plain old CD-ROM, a couple of 5.25-inch half-height, or you could combine them into one full height, I suppose, if you have something like a big old tape drive of years past. Drive bays for expansion. We have a power button, a reset button, hard drive activity LED, a hard drive failure activity LED. I'm guessing that's what the crossed out cylinder happens to mean. And then, of course, a general fault LED that comes on if something inside the system has had a bad day in some way or another. Intel inside, Pentium 3, 2 of them clocked at 733 megahertz if memory serves. Go around to the side here. Nothing really exciting there. But here we are looking at the back of the computer, and right away you can tell that even though I think this was one of Dell's more entry-level oriented models, this was definitely a proper server, and this one is outfitted with a set of redundant power supplies. The idea being that if one of these fails, not only will it turn this lovely red light on, but the other power supply will go on and be able to continue carrying the load. Sometimes you can even use that as a way to work around a faulty UPS. If you unplug just one power supply at a time, usually the machine will fail over, but that's not always the way to bet. I've had a couple of these that powered themselves off unexpectedly. Never anything in a critical or important role, just equipment that I was playing with, because I would never do that to a customer's equipment, especially anything that was mission critical. We have a very large fan here on the back. It's not as large as some that I've seen, but I'm sure it will put off plenty of a racket when we turn this thing on. There is a full card of ports on the motherboard. Everything that you see here befits a more business-oriented computer, specifically a server. We have 2 serial ports, 1 parallel port, PS2 mouse and keyboard. There are actually some USB ports. On a machine this old, they're almost certain to be USB 1.1 only. Onboard Ethernet, I would be very surprised if it wasn't gigabit. And of course, onboard video. Now, I know that servers such as this never use remotely state-of-the-art graphics processors, but they must cheapskate a little bit further on that even, because I have noticed that even when they use what was once a competent graphics processing chip, it's typically very, very slow, and I don't know if it's because they're cheapskating on memory, if they put it in a particularly disadvantaged location on the system's expansion bus, or what it might be. Speaking of the expansion bus, we have some sort of a SCSI card here. Looks like that's a little bit loose. Of course, it is missing a retention screw on this side, probably because somebody cranked in a cable way too tight. There's an add-in Ethernet card. I see this done a lot, and usually on machines that had no more need than anything the onboard Ethernet could provide, and a couple of open slot blanks suggesting that maybe someone had some particularly valuable add-in adapters that they decided to carry forward into another system rather than leaving them in this one. There's not a whole heck of a lot that's very exciting on the rest of the back panel, but you can see that the keys for the system were delivered on the back inside this little bowed out piece of stamped metal here. There's a silhouette carved into the metal of a set of keys to indicate what went there. I can't imagine that you'd want to ever put them back, but I guess if you do, you certainly have that option. Here's the system's information plate, manufacture date 012501. Don't know exactly how those are decoded, but I would take that to indicate possibly January 25th of 2001. It's hard to tell for sure because we have 2 01 series digits. So it could be the month, could be the year, could be anything really. Person could always look up the service tag, and I'm sure that someone helpful in the audience will do so. But with all of the exterior bits covered, let's go ahead and take a look inside the machine. I don't think I can open this cover on camera, but that's all right because it's really not very exciting anyway. I've opened the front cover. It's definitely attached rather tightly, suggesting that either it's sprung very tightly and is going to remain so, or it hasn't been opened a whole lot of times during its life. I have some sort of a diagram down here. I'm not totally sure what that means. Can you tell I haven't read any documentation whatsoever for this server? It's pretty obvious, isn't it? Back here we have a backplane board. Those are 80-pin SCA style connectors. The idea being that if you purchased a hard drive that had SCA style connectors on it as well, you got power and data delivery all over one connector. You didn't have to fuss with assembling a tray or anything like that. No fuss, no muss, no runs, no drips. Click the drive in, you're ready to go. This board that contains the switches and the status indicators runs almost the entire length of the front of the computer. It's really surprising that they didn't split this out, but it's definitely a nicely engineered unit. Got a very neatly folded little ribbon cable up here. There's a better look at the 3.5-inch floppy in case you have some great obsession in seeing those. There's a fan down there. It looks like you could install a second rank of hard drives in this system, and maybe that's what this is intended for. You take this out and you remove this plate, and then you install a separate backplane board. I didn't get that, so it's very unlikely that I'll be doing that. Down there in the bottom of the system is a large fan. Large fans are a common theme with these. You didn't want to bake your hardware, and again, since these were usually in some sort of a data center environment away from everyone and everything, nobody cared. Here we have a Seagate Cheetah hard drive. There's the model number if you want to look up the specifications on it. I think these are 18 gigabyte drives. You can see how they are configured, because again, this being a server environment, you might want to configure your drives so that they don't all try to start up at once if you have a lot of them, which could overwhelm the system's power supply, even a very well built system such as this. These drives are hot swappable. I don't know what kind of disk configuration this machine has, but with 3 drives it could be anything. Could be RAID 0, could be just a bunch of disks, a striping environment such as that. Could be RAID 5 with a parity volume, or RAID 1 with a hot spare. Probably more possibilities than that. But rather amazingly, all the hard drives are here, which is funny because when I bought the Dimension E310, the proprietor of the shop wouldn't let me take the hard drive with it, and I didn't push the issue. The cover is not permanently attached on this system, but I'm certainly not going to try taking it off because that plastic may have turned brittle as it has aged over time. As you can see, we have a lot of vintage dust here. I don't know what this system did. I don't know who owned it. I don't know anything of the sort about it. So we're going to continue exploring it. Maybe I'll have to take this off. I didn't think that I did. Okay, it came off without breaking anything, so bonus. I'll go ahead and take the side panel off. And you can see that someone left the slot blanks in here, or who knows, maybe they even just fell out. Maybe there never were any cards in here. Got a lot of spider webs and stuff. It's been a couple months since I acquired this system, but I assure you that spiders did not move into it in the meantime. This is an Adaptec SCSI card, probably provided by Dell. There is the onboard processor for the RAID 5 capability. An ATI Rage 2C AGP chipset. Again, not a bad performer in its time, but I'll bet it's very sluggish when we try it in this system, if this thing actually boots into something. I don't know if its disks have been wiped or not. This is the backplane board for the RAID setup. I don't know if this thing supports a second rank of disks or not. It's almost as though it wouldn't be possible to put another one of these in here, so maybe it just supports a total of 6 hard drives. I really don't know. Again, I probably ought to read the manual. Have a couple of 64-bit PCI-X slots here. These are sort of a stepping stone between the original implementation of PCI and PCI Express that we have today. These have not only a 64-bit width attachment to the rest of the system, they can also optionally run at a higher clock speed, but if you install a conventional PCI card, I believe you forcibly clock everything down to the basic 33 megahertz rate. And speaking of vintage cards, this system still has one industry standard architecture, or ISA slot. Again, if you were going to install something like an old data acquisition adapter or some sort of an out-of-band management device that was intended for an older system, you could do that with this particular unit. Now, one of the things that I commented about when I opened this video had to do with the fact that oftentimes when you buy a server, you don't get the right to use every capability that the hardware supports. A common example of this is the integrated lights out management hardware. Very often it's capable of giving you access to the system console over the network, but you actually have to license that capability in order to use it. I don't know if this system does integrated lights out management or not. I suspect that it very well could. That might explain the purpose of this large chip right here, which is not anything that I'm familiar with. But in the case of this particular system, if you wanted to utilize the built-in RAID capabilities, you had to install a special piece of hardware on the motherboard that was nothing more than a license key. So go ahead and take a look at the microprocessors here. I did know how to do this once upon a time, but I may have forgotten. I'm not sure what's holding us up here. But give me a moment and I'll be right back. Here we are now looking at what's underneath that shroud. You can see that there are some interesting chips on the motherboard. That is an Adaptec SCSI controller that is likely part of this system's RAID implementation. This DIMM that's sitting here all by itself is actually cache memory for the onboard SCSI and RAID controller. You get to store a couple of disk stripes in there, probably quite a few. I don't know how big that module is, but I think it's like 16 or 32 megabytes, so it's really nothing to write home about. Dual Pentium 3 733 megahertz processors, although you couldn't tell that by reading them. Trust me, the print is there. You can just barely make out this QR code-like structure that's been printed on the processor, but I guess that heat and time have served to fade those. I would imagine that they're Coppermine processors. I don't know what the highest end microprocessor supported by this system might be, but if I end up keeping it, which might be a little bit iffy, we may just get to find out somewhere down the line. And another server-specific trait is indicated here in the printing on the board. It says registered DIMMs required. Registered memory modules are a part of a scheme that makes it easier for the system's memory controller to work with memory modules that are situated further away from the system. They also typically implement the error correcting code, which is a get out of jail free card. If you are speaking in layman's terms, basically it means that if a single bit error within the computer's memory is detected, it can also be corrected by the system's memory controller or logic on the memory module itself. I don't know exactly how much memory this system has in it. They are labeled, but I can't really see them. I might pop them out a little bit later, but there's really no need, because when I do the power up here in just a moment, we will know for absolutely certain. This little module that's sticking up out of the board here with that blue colored connector on it is actually the RAID entitlement license. So this system is definitely set up for RAID use with its onboard SCSI adapter. The infuriating thing about this is Dell probably sold this thing for a small fortune. I don't think it would have run you as much as a kilobuck perhaps, but it definitely wouldn't have been cheap, and yet the only thing that's on here, it looks to be a little serial-style EEPROM. The good news is that time and eBay makes everything cheap. There are, of course, some people on eBay that are asking absolutely insane prices for those little entitlement keys. Luckily, there are also some people who have an idea that they'd rather sell something than sit on it for the rest of their existence or until the Earth slams into the sun. So that's a hardware overview of the motherboard. I did notice that this onboard CMOS battery is looking a little bit grunty. Come on, Handycam, I know you can focus. Do I have to focus you manually? Let's see. See if I can get it to do so. That's the big secret to professional video making right there. I cannot get that thing to focus. Just can't quite seem to do it, but if you look very carefully before we lose focus, you can see that there are actually little rust spots on that battery. So we know that it can't be very good if it's maintaining a charge at all, but it is a Renata battery, and those are typically very high-end, so I'd say we've got a chance. I certainly hope so, at least, because on the Dell PowerEdge 2500 at least, the system's RAID configuration is maintained in volatile memory. I guess the enterprising system administrator was supposed to back that up onto a diskette and make sure to keep it up to date, which probably didn't happen with rather depressing regularity. I don't know what this system does, but I'm going to go ahead and put the side panel on it. Then I'll get everything hooked up, and we'll have that smoke test that all of you out there in the viewing audience love so much. We'll see what this system does. I happened to notice while snapping the slot blanks in just now that this system appears not actually to have gigabit Ethernet. I know you're not supposed to do this, electrostatic discharge and all. But right next to the Intel Ethernet controller, which is sandwiched right in between those two cards, it's written on the motherboard 10100 Mbit Ethernet. So maybe this card that someone added, although it certainly doesn't look the part, is a gigabit capable piece. I really don't know. Oh well, time to put the side cover on this thing and see if it does anything interesting or anything at all, really. As you can clearly see, no expense has been spared in selecting a keyboard in the most superior possible condition for this experiment, just in case the magic smoke happens to come out of anything. And speaking of smoke, yes indeed folks, it is that time, and I have decided to have the camera running while I plug in each of these power cords, one for each power supply, as previously mentioned. I don't think this outlet strip is presently turned on. I think I've got to push that little white tab down in order to make that happen. But it's been so long since I've used it that I really couldn't tell you for sure. So, without any further ado, folks, smoke test! And there was a great silence. But we do have a sign of life from the monitor. No signal input. So let's go ahead and hit the power button, which is recessed, so that a dozy system administrator wouldn't be likely to do this incorrectly and accidentally reset the machine or worse. I think I figured out how this one key got to be a bit broken. Unless you mess around and jiggle this front panel, this lock doesn't want to turn easily. It tends to bind up when you're going from locked to unlocked. I don't know if the server will actually complain about that. I didn't see any kind of a switch in the lock mechanism, so maybe I ought to just leave it unlocked and hang the keys off the back of it. Let's see if our power supplies on the back are actually doing anything here. They haven't indicated any sign of life yet, but they might have to be turned on for that to happen. So here we go. Well, it makes a fair whack of noise, but it's not too bad, really. Certainly better than a lot of servers are. We have a power on self-test happening. Don't know what the current BIOS revision for this machine is. Ooh, yeah. We've lost our setup information. I hope that hasn't launched the RAID array, but I'll bet it has. I don't know when the last time this system would have seen power was. And we may not get to find out at all now. But we'll go into the setup utility. Quit that. That's something about cables, you know it? No matter how hard you try, it always seems that the cables are getting tangled up. Got about 10 million SCSI BIOSes initializing here. CD-ROM. The CD-ROM is actually SCSI. I'm surprised. Alright, let's run the setup utility. Oh wow, this is the older style Dell setup. I would have thought that this would be the gray and white screen as opposed to the green, black and white screen that the oldest Dell systems I've ever been familiar with have used. It's gone back to the year 2000. Let's see if we can do something about that. Gotta remember how to do this. There we go. March, what is it? I think... Well, we'll get the year right, and then I can figure out the day by process of elimination. Monday, March 7th, 2016. That is today's date. We have a 3.5-inch, 1.44 megabyte floppy. Fan speed, we actually get to choose. Now, that's a first. Speaking of servers that were in people's offices and were driving them crazy from the noise level, I remember a Gateway 2000 server in the office of an automotive service business that I worked for many years ago. They've since gone out of business. And the machine just absolutely roared. Now, Gateway, there's a name you don't normally associate with business class computing. But oh yeah, this was a very real and very serious server. And it was incredibly loud. It gave you no option whatsoever to govern its volume level while it was operating. There wasn't any nice fan volume control on the front panel or anything. Only later did I discover, when the receptionist and the bookkeeper finally complained about it enough and asked if there was anything I could do at all, did I go ahead and install a copy of SpeedFan and discover that even though they never utilized it, Gateway wired that system, or whoever designed it for Gateway in all probability, actually wired that system for full fan speed control. And so it was quite possible, once it had booted into Windows 2000 Server, for the system to run almost silently, and it never had a problem. It didn't overheat or anything like that. So what I think we'll do with this, I think we'll give the noise reduced option a try. We have a system fault alert, or perhaps that indicates when the LED is going to flash. I don't really know what it does. You can disable the reset button to prevent malicious operators from coming along and rebooting your server. And of course the processor serial number, which some of you younger folks may not understand the purpose of. There was actually quite an uproar over this when it happened. Intel had this glittery, shiny, dazzling idea that they would implement a processor serial number to make it possible in the wild and woolly days of e-commerce and things in the early 2000s for your computer to absolutely identify itself, or for the number to be recorded as part of someone's records so as to reduce the possibility of theft, and also to aid in locating the stolen computer. But in reality, all it did was provoke a privacy uproar. And so Intel has never again done that since, and most systems with a Pentium 3 processor actually default the serial number to disabled. If they didn't do so initially, they certainly did so after a BIOS update. It never ends. I'll tell you what, I'm sitting here making a video, and here comes my dad with a cordless phone, and much to my great dismay, it actually had enough antenna range to make it out here. Had a customer calling on the phone, needs some help installing an antivirus program, but they're not quite ready for that yet. So back to the exciting saga of Dell PowerEdge 2400 setup. I know, this is edge-of-the-seat material right here. Where were we? We're talking about the processor serial number and the privacy kerfuffle that created back in the day. Yes, that's one of those words I like very much. You see the processor bus speed and then the stepping or revision of both microprocessors. Now, some systems that are multi-processor capable, they can handle mixed stepping microprocessors, but it's best to keep them at the same revision if you can. Stepping basically refers to the version number of the microprocessor, because after Intel or any other processor, or even any chip maker, in fact, releases a product, they usually discover some errata, and if it's a serious enough mistake, they'll fix it somewhere along the line and then push out a new production run of the chip. But it's a very expensive thing to do, so a lot of times they'll try to fix it in the BIOS microcode of systems that are compatible with that particular microprocessor. Speaking more of the microprocessor, there are the two processors that are installed in the system, and they also lumped video memory along with that category. Actually, a pretty decent allocation of video memory for the early 2000s, especially for a server. We'll change the page here, see what we've got. Just basic options here, reporting or not reporting keyboard errors, because believe it or not, Dell actually sold a rack mount kit for this. I can't even begin to imagine. How many units would that be? At least 5, I would think. And they made it possible, although I don't know that I'd ever trust the thing not to go plunging straight to the bottom of the rack, at which point it would probably halt and catch fire. But they actually did allow that, and of course many times when these systems are configured, they've got them set up so that there's no keyboard attached, or they're attached to some sort of a central keyboard, video and mouse, or KVM switch. You get to set the boot sequence, you can set a system password. On a regular system, this can be inconvenient on enough. On a server, just like a laptop, it can be almost deadly, because some servers implement a strict enough security policy that you can't disable certain kinds of passwords just by going into the case and throwing a jumper. You may actually have to call the vendor, or in the worst case, you might have to replace the motherboard, which is not going to happen for a system like this, not at this point. I certainly wouldn't put that much money or effort into it. No password is installed. You can actually prevent the option from being modified. I don't know how strict that is. There's no password for setup. The USB is enabled, mouse is enabled, serial ports are set to auto, the parallel port is enabled. There's the Ethernet controller that's built into the motherboard and its MAC address, which rather interestingly, although I'm sure you could change that under control of the drivers via the locally administered address setting, you can't change it from within setup. I don't know if they didn't want people doing that, if they didn't intend to support it, or if they simply intended for people to do so within a configured operating system if they so desired. The diskette controller can be set to automatic, write protected, or turned off entirely. We'll leave it on auto. We'll leave the speaker on. Onboard RAID is off. I'm going to leave that off for right now, but I think it's going to have to be turned on. There's only 2 pages worth of setup information, which is kind of surprising for a server. But we'll go ahead and reboot this thing. It didn't ask me if I wanted to save changes, which is a little bit surprising. And we'll see if it manages to come up here, but I think it's going to tell me that it has nothing to boot from. These things do take quite a while to get through their entire power on self-test, because as a server, wow, did you hear the fan speed drop? Didn't drop a whole lot, but it dropped some. I forget where I was even going with that. I lost my train of thought. That's me getting distracted by a fan. Those are the things that happen when you're making videos. Oh well, if I think of it, I'll come back to it later. We'll see what this thing will do. I don't think it'll boot. I don't think it's got a chance in the world, since it's lost all its configuration information. Alright, this might be the last one. I think this is the one to which the CD-ROM drive is attached. Yep, nothing happening for a boot. So I guess I'll go ahead and see if I can actually configure this system's disk resources. Put the camcorder down while I do that. I'm sure there are some of you who'd want to see it, but this requires a lot of thought, and it's pretty dry anyway, so not going to do that. I wonder how it determines that the firmware is out of date. At first I thought it was saying something about the firmware being mismatched, and maybe it is mismatched relative to the version of the flash BIOS or something, the primary BIOS. I don't know. Or maybe they just assume that by now Dell should have released a new one. It's hard to tell. Alright, we'll go in here to the Adaptec SCSI utility, and while I think this is the expansion card, to tell you the truth. So I don't think it's going to show me, I forget where this is, I haven't done this in a long time, to see what disks might or might not be attached to this, but I don't think it's going to turn up any, because I think this 2940 is the add-in card, and yep, the only guy that's home on the bus is the Adaptec 2940 Ultra Wide. So that's definitely not the configuration utility that I want. So let me fiddle around with this a little bit more, and I'll see if I can actually get the system to do what it should do. I went into the setup utility, I changed the configuration to RAID, and now we have a Dell PowerEdge expandable RAID controller add-in BIOS that's trying to come up. It's making some interesting noises from those hard drives. Maybe they're not too good. Or maybe they were spun down. But yes, the RAID controller has a power-on self-test and startup process just like the rest of the computer. It occurred to me that maybe the problem with this firmware is out of date notice has to do with the two being at different revisions. It certainly couldn't be the date as I thought it might be earlier because, well, the date wasn't set. Alright, let's see if there is possibly any RAID configuration that's left in this system. This is not good, I don't think. We're going to reject the configuration for right now, just to view it. Just want to see what containers there are. Okay. Much to my amazement, there is actually a RAID 5 volume set up on this machine. I can't believe that this might work. I know I'm an eternal optimist, but prior experience with systems like this just hasn't left me thinking in a very positive fashion. So here we go again for the third time, because the third time is most definitely the charm. The system's power-on self-test process. I assure you it doesn't get any more exciting as you continue to run it. I'd sportscast this just for the heck of it if I had anything remotely clever to say. These drives were configured for staggered startup to save load on the power supply and keep from overloading it if there were more of them. Although pretty much any power supply with any mark of quality whatsoever in its build ought to be able to spin up 6 hard drives without having a problem. Of course, people tend to cheap out on their power supplies very, very badly. And then they're surprised when their system doesn't work. I had somebody write me a message here on YouTube recently asking if they thought that a certain power supply was appropriate for this wonderful system configuration. I think it was a gaming build. And they spent so much money on their graphics card and their motherboard, and then they were going to buy a $30 power supply. And I'm like, you absolutely should not do that. That is a bad idea. I've never understood that attitude. Build it right, or build it 10 times. Uh-oh. Did somebody rob a hard drive out of this thing, or did one of the drives fail? I don't know. We'll push enter and see what happens. It's critical. It's going to fail. Dr. Bill, we must save this server. Rush it into operating quickly. I don't think anybody's going to rush it into operating as long as the power-on self-test happens to take. I guess one of those hard drives is bad. Or somebody swiped one of them. Should probably try to find another. But it doesn't really matter because I'm going to wipe the drives on this system anyway. I'll dismantle the RAID set and do it from another machine just to make sure it gets done properly. Windows NT Server version 4. Wow. Been a long time since I've seen one of these. The last one of these that I saw in production use was back in 2006 or 7 thereabouts. It's certainly been a while. But then again, this is an older system, and a lot of people were sticking with NT Server back in the day. because it was what they knew and loved. Although I gotta tell you, Windows 2000 was such an upgrade. Just the matter alone of not having to reinstall the service pack every time you change the operating system's configuration was worth its weight in gold. 256 megabytes in memory, installed memory in this system. I would have expected a little bit more, but hey, you can't have everything. And I don't imagine that I'm going to know the password when it starts up, so guess I'm not going to worry about that too much. I'll just see if it starts up, and then I'll proceed straight to wiping the disks. We'll go ahead and try it just for grits and shins, I guess. Yeah, I don't think it's going to let me log on. No way. That password was not blank. No way. IT security, folks. It's important. It's taken a long time to log in, so I'm not totally sold that that'd work, but I think NT Server would reject the password almost immediately if it was wrong. So I guess we'll see. We got our little warning light flashing there. It's not very happy. The crossed out hard drive light's not on. I'm still thinking about this. Guess I'll be back if and when it does decide to log me onto the system. Alright, the password is evidently not blank. I don't really care what it is. I don't want to know. But I can't shut down the system. Well, what am I going to do now? Oh well, it pains me to do this. Believe me, it really does. But with one little flip of a switch, a beast of a machine falls asleep. Well, the hard drive light's blinking. I'll wait until it stops. I won't be quite that mean to it. And since I'm going to try not to be the meanest person in the world to this poor old thing, I guess we'll take a look at these power supplies, see what they're doing. Their fans are throttling themselves up and down in a very erratic manner. Either that or that's the weirdest bad bearing noise I've ever heard. But this is running nicely. Listen to that if you can hear it over the wind noise. Not actually sure which fan is doing that. Uh-oh! Controller message, RAID 5 failover container 0, no failover assigned. So they didn't define a hot spare drive in this system. Well, they didn't have one to define, because RAID 5 requires a minimum of 3 drives, 2 for interleaving and 1 for the parity that you get out of jail free card. You should always define a hot spare, and apparently they never thought of that. Of course, then again, it was probably pretty expensive to think of that. Well, everyone, that is the entirety of the video. So thank you very much for watching, and by all means, do feel free to leave a comment if you have one. And I want you to know it pained me greatly to do that. It really did. I know that was not a nice thing to do. And here's something kind of a bonus feature, or an epilogue, if you want to think of it that way, just to close up a few loose ends about this system, some of the things that I have learned. First of all, pulled out for no reason other than the fact I could, is one of the redundant power supplies that this system has. This is a Newton Power manufactured unit capable of 330 watts maximum output total. So maybe if you did, even though this is an extremely heavy and well-made power supply, so much so that the fan even has a tachometer line so that the power supply's logic knows if it's running. There are actually 2 fans in the power supply. But I would imagine that this could be overwhelmed if you had 6 hard drives that decide to spin up at once. I don't know how these are managed, if they both carry a small portion of the load from time to time, or if one of them drops out, the other one simply seamlessly takes over. As I've written in the bottom of the case, I did decide to go ahead and replace this CMOS battery. The rust spots really don't show up, but it's slightly swollen, and I'm sure it would have been right on the cusp of leaking. And if we make a very quick and informal test here, it's completely flat. There's no life left in that thing whatsoever. So now, it has a spiffy brand new one right there on the motherboard. Speaking of the motherboard, I mentioned this ISA slot earlier, as having possible use for an out-of-band management device. And guess what? That's exactly what it's marked for. I don't think this thing's onboard management hardware has sort of any sort of remote control functionality, because further down we have a PCI slot that's marked the DRAC slot, or DRAC. And I believe that is Dell Remote Access Controller. Could be wrong though, haven't seen one of those in a long time. And look at those dust bunnies in that PCI slot. Wow. Alright everybody, that is well and truly the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, certainly do feel free to leave a comment if you happen to have one. But wait, there's more! I know, I almost didn't believe it myself. You'd think I'd let this go and let this video come to an end. I think I was right about the date on the back of the case, that it is month, day, year, because here's a date that was stamped in the case, probably when it was manufactured. And I guess it didn't take Dell any time at all to pop this thing out down the assembly line and get it into the hands of its new owner. Also discovered some interesting little LEDs on the motherboard. They're labeled in fly-spec sans serif, so I don't know if we can get the camera to focus on them. Not all of them are populated. One of them says i960 mode 0, which would refer to an operating mode for this RAID coprocessor that handles the parity calculations when running in RAID 5. The other LEDs are for hard drive, power, and standby, of all things. There's also a serial port down here that says SER RAID and test. So maybe that's some sort of in-system debugging connector. Certainly not a standard pinout for something like a JTAG. I don't think you'd need that many pins. And that's typically done over a parallel connection, at least on the host. So I'm not really sure what all that stuff is for, but it's likely manufacturing test stuff that isn't terribly interesting. Likewise, there's something here that says i960 prog. i960, can't read that one, strap, I think. So evidently there's a lot of recovery capability or manufacturing test capability built into this board. Alright, that is well and truly it, I promise.